Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called Humanity's Psionic Deficiency, written by Aware Material 507. When the species of humanity first entered the Galactic Federation, excitement and trepidation were prevailing emotions for everyone watching. A new species was a somewhat rare event, as many of the sapient species that came close to reaching FTL or such other terrestrial navigation techniques kill themselves before they make it. As such, new species entering the community meant that new wealth of technology and insights could be gained from the newest species wise enough to decide that they would prefer to live. However, as humanity's envoy flew in on a boxy and frail starship that lacked a hint of psionic infusion, much of that trepidation was lost and was replaced with confusion. As it turned out, humanity was almost completely devoid of any of the psionic potential that every other species contained. As such, had not developed a speck of technology in the branch of psionics, and even had an entirely mundane version of FTL, unfamiliar to the community. Admittedly, humanity's material sciences was rather well advanced, as it rivaled even the most technologically dedicated species. However, it is generally understood that psionics are simply more efficient. One could create a fusion generator to power their ship and ion thrusters to move it. However, a psionic engine and star sail are far more energy efficient as well as less volatile. The one thing that material sciences could do better than psionics was reliability, which meant that they were only reserved for auxiliary and support roles for the most cautious of captains. This put humanity at a disadvantage in terms of advancement and industry, which was a shame, as they had no influence on the matter. Regardless, humanity was welcomed into the community with open arms, and many species opened relations with the burgeoning species, who were determined to do what they could despite their inherent handicap. And so they expanded into the galaxy, colonizing new worlds with the occasional bit of help from their neighbors and generally living their lives. The humans turned out to be a pleasure to be around, as their optimistic view on the world rubbed off on everyone. Curious humans joined the Galactic Federation in the research of all fields, including psionics, and their innovative minds threw out suggestions to problems they only had theoretical knowledge over. These talented humans then took back the knowledge that they had accumulated and advanced their species' technology and industry rapidly until they were on par with the rest of the Federation. As the Federation learned more about them, it was eventually discovered that the humans did actually have some latent psionic potential in the form of a sixth sense. It would seem that the humans of the past referred to this as the gut feelings, and research into expanding humanity's capabilities were beginning to take root. It was beginning to look like humanity had the potential to utilize those abilities and join the rest of the community in psionics. That was until they came. From the edges of known space and the intergalactic void, eldritch monstrosities began to make themselves known as they almost swam through the greatest blackness of space towards the little section of the galaxy that the Galactic Federation had been established. Those who initially discovered the monsters dubbed them the Devouring Swarm, as they recorded the complete consumption of a thankfully uninhabited life-bearing planet on the fringes of space. Scouts and scanners predicted that they would hit the closest inhabited systems within a year at the earliest. With news of the incoming threat, armadas were formed and expanded as armies marshaled and trained. All the while, humanity aided the effort where they could, while quietly converting their factories. As the last preparations were finished, the many fleets and armies jumped to the first inhabited system that was in the path of the eldritch monsters. With the path of the swarm unknown variable, the planet had been nearly entirely evacuated, leaving the world nearly uninhabited, aside from the local fauna and a few uncooperative locals. As the Federation armies made their planet wall and began setting up a planet for defensive campaign, the Armada began splintering into wide picket formations around the system. As they moved out, humanity positioned to join them. However, the newly formed Galactic War Council decided that they would prove more of a hindrance than an aid once contact was initiated, and thus only approved the humans to act as supporting vessels. It was decided that the human psionicless fleet would act as a rear guard, evacuating wounded and non-combatants and resupplying the main fleets when needed. And with that, time had run out, and the devouring swarm from behind the galactic veil were upon them all. Their hulking behemoths of the abyss eclipsed the stars as thousands of smaller parasitic ships swarmed out from them before they were met with psionic lance and detonation. Ships danced and dodged with the grace and finesse of masters as psionic beams cut through swaths of the mass of tentacles and claws that made up the eldritch fleets. All was going well for the first few hours of the engagement, and it would have continued to do so if one of the three largest abominations let out a psychic wail which washed through the Armada in its entirety. Those ships closest to the Goliath spontaneously lost all psionic energy, cutting off their propulsion and weapons in totality. They were butchered like animals. Those fortunate to be farther from the blast suffered heavy reductions in psionic power, leading to partial systems failure, leaving those lucky ships to only be hobbled, but not crippled. As for all the ships caught in between those two extremes, it quickly devolved into chaos as the eldritch fleets descended upon their wounded prey. As the carnage ensued and the combined fleets of the Galactic Federation were torn apart piecemeal, the 30-odd human ships delegated to the backline began beelining it towards the battle as fast as their ion thrusters could push them. By the time that the humans arrived into the battle with their kinetic coil guns and missile tubes, the psionic shockwave had dissipated. However, the damage had already been done. Hundreds of the best ships the races of the galaxy could muster had already been consumed, and those left were well on their way to succumbing to the swarm. The commanders in charge of the combined armada screamed at the humans over the communication links to fall back, to warn the council, but were only met with silence as the human contingent dove into the fray. Metal slugs and nuclear detonations quite literally exploded out of human ships as they tore through the offending monstrosities, giving those Federation ships who had survived the onslaught a chance to escape the carnage. As much of the initial shock of humanity's attack managed to do in terms of beating back the hordes of the eldritch monsters, such success was short-lived as the motivated but outnumbered human ships were taken out, one by one. Soon, there was only one cruiser left, firing out of the dozens of sister ships that had initially charged with her. However, the humans did not break, nor falter, in their duty as the final ship rushed forward towards one of the eldritch Goliaths and played the last card afforded the crew. As the light of the ship's self-destructing reactor shone on the retreating forces of the broken Federation Armada, a psionic screech sounded out as one of the largest of the eldritch ships died. The death seemed to reverberate across the horde as many of the smaller ships closest to the dying Goliath spasmed violently before expiring, leaving the Federation fleet the chance to flee far from what would be deemed as the first battle for the Agonath system. Coalescing back at the closest inhabited planet, which had quickly become garrisoned and fortified by the many armies of the Federation, the ragged fleets sent back news of their defeat to the Council and the terrifying weapons used by the devouring swarm of the Void to cripple them. Soon enough, the fleets got a returning message stating that they were to fall back to the nearest industrial world for repairs and leave the ground forces to hold the line until reinforcements could be mustered. This was a grim decision that many of the still surviving fleet commanders objected to, as it would practically doom those left to defend the world. However, the reality was that they were in no state to argue, as the Armada was down to 60% of its original strength. Additionally, more than 80% of those ships were suffering from major hull breaches and needed repairs desperately. And so, with a heavy heart, the fleet departed. And with that, the ground forces left on Argonath Prime were on their own. With the knowledge that they only had so much time before the swarm would be upon them, the ground commanders quickly set about preparing the world for a planetary siege. Psionic shields were set up along with the more conventional shield generators of humanity around the 5 major cities. Both mundane and psionic gun emplacements were constructed and manned. Troop deployment was arranged and fallback points were prepared. At the insistence of the human commander, humanity's forces were positioned at the most vital and strategic points, with the knowledge that if the worst came and all psionic equipment would be disabled, those points would still have an effective garrison. And so, the great hordes from beyond the veil approached. Soon their hulking mass hung over the planet, and thousands upon millions of their numbers descended down upon the planet. Anti-air batteries and psionic cannons fired up into the sky as atmospheric fighters of both varieties performed dogfights with their eldritch counterparts. The swarms of monsters crashed against the various shields constructed around each of the major cities in the world, all of which were quickly chipped and cracked before they shattered under the weight of the slain corpses. And then it was the infantry's time to shine, as psionic pulse weapons and kinetic slug throws held back the tides of the chitinous claws and razor-sharp teeth of the swarm. The first wave was repulsed with only minor casualties as the armies of the Federation held the line against the hordes of monstrosities. Bullets and psionic pulses coalesced into a torrent of death as the eldritch abominations were cut down in the tens of thousands. The second wave is where things began to have problems as larger variants of the eldritch swarmlings began appearing, and they seemed to possess a toned-down version of the psionic whale, which left the Federation's weapons simply ineffective against the larger variants and the horde of swarmlings around them. This wave tore through the planet, and the less numerous human soldiers were unable to handle every incident, and thus nearly all of the outlying settlements and minor towns were abandoned in favor of fortifying the core cities. Here, the humans could more reasonably react to the new swarmling forms. It was quickly determined that these new, larger synapse swarmlings were a major threat given their psionic nullifying abilities, and as such, counter-tactics were conceived. Soon the human forces were splintered, with human snipers and sharpshooters being stationed all across the battlefield, taking out the larger synapse swarmlings to give their fellow troopers a chance. That is not to say that there were no times where the front line broke and ran, or was crushed by the onslaught of the swarm. No. Hundreds of soldiers, both alien and human alike, broke and ran at the sight of the boards. However, thousands more stood firm and held the line against the devouring swarm. Nevertheless, this battle of attrition was not a sustainable one. Slowly but surely, the Federation allied forces were being pushed back one step after the other. Additionally, supplies were only so plentiful after the logistics ships were forced to retreat when the Eldritch fleet entered orbit. The first city to fall was the coastal city of Narrated, as thousands of swarmlings charged out of the fields, while higher forms sprung out of the water to wreak havoc on the back lines of the Federation garrison. Thankfully, through a system of underground train tunnels that linked the capital city of Imperator to the coastal city, most of the personnel and remaining civilians were able to make it out before the last of the automated defenses failed. Unfortunately, the majority of the equipment stored in the city was lost with it, but regardless, the survivors made it through the tunnels unimpeded before manually collapsing their escape route once everyone was clear. The second city was the aerodrome city of Wembep Peaks, as hordes of flight-capable swarmlings filled the skies with their bodies, while thousands of ground-based eldritch monsters charged up the mountain. Wembep Peaks was a premier aerospace base, as it possessed hundreds of hangars and repair fields in the tandem with the already high altitude. Allied fighters and bombercraft were able to easily repair and resupply after combat. Its loss would have crippled the United Federation's aerial capabilities, and it would seem that the swarms knew it. Close-range carpet bombing and strafing runs from the aircraft stationed there were run near constantly as the siege continued. Hundreds of thousands of swarmlings were torn apart and burned to a crisp under the roaring heat of a plasma torpedo. It was looking favorably for the defending garrison as the anti-air batteries and interceptors were able to keep the flying swarmlings at bay, which meant that the enemy needed to crawl up miles of mountain before reaching the front lines. Unfortunately for the garrisons defending the city, tunnelers burrowed into the mountains that the city was built on and began swarming into the defenses. The worst of the casualties were avoided with a quick reaction force that took out the tunnelers, but there was now a gap in the defenses that the swarm would be sure to exploit. And with that, the garrison was forced to retreat via air transport. Some soldiers decided to stay behind and manually control some of the anti-air batteries in order to give those transports a fighting chance at making it to the Imperator. However, even with their sacrificial effort, more than a fourth of the transports were brought down before they reached their destination. Those who volunteered were killed to the last trooper as swarmlings flooded through the freshly dug tunnels and overwhelmed the deserted city. The last city to fall was the industrial city of Urenthal, and it took quite a while for it to do so. Having the advantage of being built on a thick and dense patch of bedrock, the city was more or less immune to the tunnelers that Wembep Peaks had succumbed to. Additionally, the many factories and forges had been handed over to the Human Engineer Corps, who spent a considerable amount of time converting their production capabilities from psionic equipment and consumer goods into good old-fashioned bullets and rifles. This gave the city a near unparalleled strategic value, and there was a reason why 2/5 of the human soldiers stationed on the planet were deployed there. As the swarm descended down upon the city, they were quickly met with torrents of rifle fire from the humans and Federation soldiers equipped with freshly made weapons. This, unfortunately, garnered some rather unwanted attention from the eldritch monstrosities, as the bulk of the abominations seemed to be drawn to the city like moths to a flame. Thousands upon thousands of the swarmlings rushed across the hilly terrain, all the while being peppered with bullets from the defending soldiers and blown apart by artillery. It was here that the worst of the fighting took place, as higher forms of swarmlings became commonplace and new, more deadly variants showed themselves. Stalkers, tankers, acid spitters. If you could come up with it in a nightmare, it was there and killing someone. The garrison held out as long as they could, but it was a losing battle. By the time the Wembe peak spell and the bombing runs with it, the city of Urunthal was down to half their original number. Eventually, when it was decided that the city was doomed, the remaining soldiers gathered all that they could reasonably carry, stuffed it all into a few remaining ground vehicles that had survived the last couple of months of combat, and made a desperate attempt to flee back to the last 2 surviving cities. The trek was a dangerous one, as they had to fight through swarm-controlled territory to reach the closest defensive emplacements. However, given that the other option was to face total annihilation, the troopers decided to roll the dice. They made it. Mostly. By the time that they arrived back into friendly territory, a full third of their vehicles had been destroyed, and the remaining ones were in rough shape. But they had made it, and with them were enough weapons to arm most of the remaining soldiers that made up the garrisons of the 2 remaining cities. Empretal and Karif. Now, Empretal managing to hold on was fairly reasonable, given that nearly all of the reinforcements had been recovering there and after each of the cities fell. But how could Karif survive? Well, it's simple. While technically considered 2 different cities, Karif and Empretal were built so close together that they were practically part of the same city, and thus the 2 had a well-connected logistics network, allowing for the garrisons to mutually support each other. It also does not hurt that the city Karif was home to the largest city agrarian district on the planet, and thus made it one of the most vital cities in the event of a planetary siege. As the last of the soldiers from Untrutal settled in and the weapons they brought were distributed, the garrisons of the twin cities braced for the final assault and prepared themselves to either hold the line or die trying. However, the assault never came, as, up in orbit of the planet, the second battle for Argonaut's system started with a bang. 30 magnetically accelerated cannon rounds slammed into one of the 2 remaining juggernaut-sized monstrosities, each with the energy required to level a small city. Humanity and the Galactic Federation had not been idle while their armies fought and died on Argonath Prime. Ever since news of the Eldritch monstrosities hit human territories, industry once spent producing the many consumer goods that humanity exported were hastily converted into military factories. All across human space, the first frigates and cruisers were flying off the orbit shipyards and surface dry docks, while battleships and carriers were being brought online before the first psionic lance was fired. The half-year of early warning, and the 3 months bought by the hundreds of thousands who died in the ground campaign, was just enough time for 10 dozen ships filled with humanity's best to be marshaled in time. Following behind the vessels of humanity was the recumbent Federation fleet, which had spent the 3 months reconsolidating their numbers and retrofitting their systems. While not as effective as human designs, the vastly more numerous Federation fleet was able to be brought up to fighting ship, equipped with mundane weapons and armor as well as experimental psionic weapons that had been designed to resist the whales. Together, they burned forward and collapsed upon the unexpected abominations in a blaze of untempered fury. Magnetic railguns cycled, firing sequences at carrier cruisers and battleships discharged brave or crazy human pilots. As the Eldritch fleet sluggishly reared its fangs and prepared to charge forth, human torpedo frigates drove into the fray, spewing their nuclear payloads into the heart of the Eldritch formations. Federation vessels lit up the void with laser and plasma as they danced across the stars with a faint hum of iron engines filling their ears and raging fire in their hearts. The wounded Eldritch Goliaths screeched and wailed their death cry as a lucky shot from the Federation battleship hit something vital, and for the second time the swarm stuttered and stopped, as if overwhelmed by the death of their mothership. Coil gun rounds and laser beams streaked across the void and ripped apart the disoriented swarmling ships as the final Goliath ship began to drift back in a desperate attempt to avoid the fate of their sister ship. A second barrage of railgun shots to what the Galactic Community Research Team deduced was the propulsion system of the monstrosity was enough to stop that. Bloodthirsty Federation ships and still eager human frigates and cruisers all dove upon the wounded Eldritch abomination like a school of piranhas as it was torn apart, one shell or plasma lace at a time. When all was said and done, the Eldritch monstrosities had been slain. The Galactic Community had won. In the years that followed, humanity had fully restored their industrial base back to civilian production, while still keeping a significant portion to keep the expanded expeditionary fleet running in tip-top shape. Occasionally, another hive abomination would drift out of the warp along with the Goliath of a hive ship, However, permanently standing guard over the system of Argonath, the combined Sentinel Armada stands watch prepared to face to fight them at every step of the way. And in the hulls of every ship in that fleet is a human reactor, burning hot and ready, waiting for the opportunity to vent its fury on those who attack the galaxy. End of story. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Casper Arnholt, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.